Welcome back, everyone. This afternoon, we have a slightly shorter session, I believe. It's now an hour long. So we have 2 presentations and then a 30-minute discussion, which I hope you'll all participate in. First of all, we're going to hear from Julia Gatley. Julia is head of the School of Architecture and Planning at the University of Auckland, New Zealand. She's also a historian of New Zealand architecture, and her most recent book is A Centennial History of the Auckland School, co-edited with Lucy Treep. Our second speaker is Sylvana Taher. She is a writer and an architect. She studied economics and politics at UCL and development and planning at the Bartlett. She gained her diploma in architecture at the AA in 2011, and since then has been teaching in history and theory. And this year, she started teaching an intermediate design studio at Central St. Martin's on the role of nature in the city. Her writing has appeared in the AA Files, Publica, Blueprints, and the AR. So, Julia, could I welcome you?
So, the University of Auckland began teaching architecture in 1917, the same year that the AA admitted women as students. The Auckland School was New Zealand's only professionally recognised school of architecture until the mid-1970s, and its history therefore underscores many of the developments in the country's 20th century architecture. In September of this year, the school celebrated its centenary with the launch of an edited book surveying its history, as well as exhibitions and other events. This paper draws from the book and exhibition research to present and reflect upon what this 100 years of architecture has meant for women. It shows that while the Auckland School was a distinctly male and masculine environment for much of its 100-year history, women have almost always been present, including a particular bubble of women students at the end of World War II, growing numbers from 1972, and gender balance starting to become apparent from the late 1990s. So one of the several exhibitions for the centenary was an expanded version of a timeline that was built up by an organisation called Architecture Plus Women New Zealand, formed in 2011 to raise the visibility of women architects through such means as publication and exhibition. This timeline was first shown in 2013, and for each subsequent showing, new panels have been added to it in different colours. You can see the various colours, and the dark blue panels are the ones that were new for this particular version, but show all the names of the women students attending the Auckland School up into the 1980s, when the list started to get very long. Knight's first major achievement in the school was the introduction of a full-time degree in architecture, and this was offered from 1926. Like his own education at the University of Liverpool, it used Beaux-Arts methods with emphases on the history of architecture, particularly classicism, as well as drawing, rendering, the esquisse, and the formal crit. The first students to graduate with a Bachelor of Architecture did so in 1931. In 1926, the school had 50 students, of which 15 were enrolled full-time. The first woman to sit and pass exams in the school did so that year. This was Laura Cassels-Brown. Knight seemed pleased to have her in the school, saying that year, and I quote, "So far as I can see, there is no reason why women should not take up architecture as a profession. Most architects need a girl for secretarial work, such as typing specifications and letters, but there's not enough work of that kind to occupy the whole of a girl's time. So if she could undertake drafting as well, she could be sure of permanent employment," end quote. 2 more women enrolled the following year, Beatrice Smith and Merle Greenwood. Cassels-Brown and Smith completed standalone papers, whereas Greenwood enrolled in the B-Arch and became the first woman to complete the degree in New Zealand, graduating in 1933. Other early women graduates included Dorothy Wills in 1935, Mary Edwards in 1939, and Nancy Northcroft in 1940. Of these, Nancy Northcroft was awarded an Empire Scholarship for Women, moved to London to study town planner, and became well known as a planner. Before World War II, the school was producing up to 8 architecture graduates a year. Enrolments, but later in the war and after the war, enrolments mushroomed. There was a 6-fold increase in student numbers from 40 students in 1942 to 240 in 1947. First-year enrolments jumped the most, including a jump from 30 students in 1945 to 70 in 1946. The school really struggled to cope with this mushroom of numbers and with shortages in both space and staffing. It only had 5 full-time members of staff at that time and started using senior students as tutors in studio. Students made formal complaints about the program at that time, and ultimately this led to the appointment of more full-time staff, so that by 1951 there were 15 of them, all men, of course. In addition to being larger, the classes of the mid-1940s had more women students, as many as 6 of them in the 1945 cohort. It seems that the opportunities that the war had offered women to work in jobs historically undertaken by men now also encouraged those finishing high school to consider the profession as being open to them. Of particular note of these students, Lillian Laidlaw, later Crystal, who started in 1944, became the first woman to teach in the school, working as a part-time studio teacher in 1948 after the end of her 4th year. She had a successful career in practice and in 1967 became the first woman to earn a New Zealand Institute of Architects Medal for Design. Among the 30 of the students who enrolled in first year in 1945 were Marilyn Hart, Nancy Martin and Barbara Parker. In their second year, Hart and Parker joined a collective called the Architectural Group, who published a manifesto and a magazine. Marilyn Hart did not finish her degree, but worked in practice in the UK nonetheless, and later earned a reputation as a writer, particularly on housing. Barbara Parker also practiced in the UK for a while and had a career in the film industry. The third of these 3 women, Nancy Martin, moved to Sydney in 1960, where she specialised in lighting design. She was appointed to the academic staff of the University of New South Wales and completed a PhD there, also in lighting. The particularly large first-year cohort of 1946 had 4 women in it, and from that point, the number of women students began to shrink. This is apparent in the 1950s, and it continued in the 1960s. While the size of the school as a whole continued to grow, reaching 300 in 1960, the number of women in those 2 decades was very small, and sometimes there were none. These were the baby boom years in which many young women whose lives had been impacted by war often followed the norm of marriage, housewifery, and motherhood. In addition, Jill Mathewson has recently identified physics as an issue in these 1960s demographics. The school restructured its degree in 1961. Prior to this, it had offered a Diploma of Architecture as well as the Bachelor of Architecture, with the differences between the 2 of them being that the degree required students to enrol in physics and also to complete a final year thesis, whereas the diploma did not require either of those 2 things. And the diploma also served as an option for direct entry students who had served some of their articles in practice. But with the new degree structure of 1961 and through until the mid-1990s, students were not admitted straight into the school in first year, in their first year at university, but had to complete an intermediate year comprising first-year physics, as well as electives from a range of courses offered by the faculties of arts and sciences, followed by 4 professional years in the school. So this brought the BArch into alignment with other professional degrees, and it also allowed students to do their first year at any New Zealand university. It had an impact upon women because some of girls' high schools at that time weren't teaching physics, which meant that they couldn't go straight into that intermediate year and do university level physics, so they couldn't enter the degree program. They did, though, still have the option of enrolling in the Diploma of Architecture, although the university was also starting to phase out the diploma, and the New Zealand Institute of Architects was also supporting the phasing out of the diploma at that time. So these things contributed to the small number in the 1960s. Student demographics changed again from 1972, when suddenly, in a first-year class of 70, there were 13 women students. The school had revised its rules for the intermediate year, and from 1971, students could do either maths or physics in their intermediate rather than it having to be physics. And this reopened the door for women who'd not been taught physics at high school. One of the first-year students from 1972, Denise Civil, has reflected on her time in the school. She recalls the very male atmosphere of the place and the sexist comments made by male staff and students, including, quote, an oft-quoted piece of research that apparently proved that women had difficulty visualising in 3D, end quote. But this class, it wasn't an anomaly in its demographics. It was the start of a new trend, with 1973 seeing another 10 women entering first year, and subsequent years also showing gradual increase. By 1976, 1/3 of the incoming students were women. A year earlier, in 1975, the school also saw its first woman graduate with a PhD in architecture. This was Susan Nicolescu, who subsequently moved to the United States and had a career in practice there. The number of women students continued to increase during the 1980s and 1990s, reaching close to gender balance in the late 90s, but still fluctuating. The proportion of women architecture graduates was also increasing to 39% by the late 1990s and to 50% from 2007. The rise of feminism during the 1970s meant not only more women students, but also more political awareness and more activism aimed at the male establishment. In 1979, a group of these women activists focused attention on the fact that the school still had no women on the full-time academic staff, although an artist, Claudia Pond-Ely, had taught drawing part-time since 1974 with Pat Hanley, who was a well-known New Zealand artist. The women activists wrote to Professor Alan Wilde, who was the head of school at that time, pressuring him to appoint one or more women to the staff. When a position in drawing came up, the school solicited applications from women, and in 1981, it appointed Sarah Treadwell to the job. Sarah Treadwell had completed her B.Arch in the school in 1976 and had practiced in Wellington and in London. She taught drawing and developed a very different approach compared with that of Pat Hanley and Claudia Pond-Ely. Where Hanley had encouraged loose drawing with a focus on the big issues, Treadwell took a speculative or critical approach to representation and allowed for fineness and care with detail. This underscored the school's design and drawing culture for many years. It included painstaking rendering by hand, and in the 1980s and 1990s, the Auckland school earned a reputation as a drawing school. From 1986, Treadwell also taught an elective course entitled Women and Architecture, later Engendering Architecture, and encouraged student research on some of New Zealand's early women architects. She remained the only woman on the full-time staff for 10 years. In 1990, an accreditation visiting panel concluded that this was unacceptable. It recommended that at least half of new appointments should be women. The school appointed Rosemarie Schofield in 1991, Diane Brand in 94, Brenda Vale in 96, Judy Cockram in 1998, and more in subsequent years. The school, which became part of the Faculty of Creative Arts and Industries in 2004, and then merged with the Department of Planning to become the School of Architecture and Planning in 2006, has had good gender balance among students for many years now, and even an emergent majority of women in both architecture and urban planning. It's currently sitting at 58% women students in architecture. It has gender balance among the urban planning staff, while among the architecture staff, just under 1/3 are women. This sounds low until the figure is compared with practice. It's still the case that less than 1/4 of New Zealand's registered architects are women. Notable, however, is the fact that the Faculty of Creative Arts and Industries has been led by 3 consecutive women serving as Dean since 2004, and the School of Architecture and Planning has been led by 5 consecutive women serving as heads since 2006. This is unusual even today. Here are the staff today. So to summarise, the paper shows that women were welcome in the school from the outset. The number of women students increased noticeably in the mid-1940s before dropping again and remaining small until 1972, when it increased rapidly and continued to increase gradually until starting to approach gender balance in the late 90s. Today, 1/3 of the architecture staff are women, but notably with a series of women serving as both deans of the faculty and heads of the school. The low proportion of women in practice remains of greater concern. It was this that gave rise to the formation of Architecture Plus Women New Zealand in 2011. This organisation continues to work to raise the visibility of women architects, and as a result, the school was really proud to have hosted an updated version of this Architecture Plus Women NZ timeline as part of the events for the centenary celebrations in 2017 to demonstrate the institution's contribution to the history of women in architecture in New Zealand. Thank you very much.
Hello. My name is Sylvie Taher, and the topic that I want to discuss today is when education fails. So I'd like to start with a brief caveat. Everything that I'm going to be saying is incredibly personal. I'm not going to be giving you very many facts at all. Hopefully, though, as the kind of conversation progresses, you will understand my logic in doing that. To begin, I wanted to just quickly kind of raise the question, why do I want to discuss the idea of education failing? And why do I think I'm the right person to do it? So I have studied at the AA. I've also taught at the AA. And aside from the 10 years that I have spent here, either as a student or as a teacher, I also spent another 4 years studying economics and politics, 1 year studying planning and development, a surprising 9 months studying pastry, because sometimes a person really does need cake in their life. And what I hope that this rather odd curriculum vitae of mine will convey to you all is that I have a very ambiguous relationship with education. Having spent the larger part of my life in it, in one form or another, you might imagine that this is a relationship based on love. As an active member in said relationship, I can say that no such love exists. It is first and foremost a love-hate relationship. If anything, it is a relationship defined by ambiguity. In brief, my wish to discuss this topic stems from the fact that I have had a very long and very bumpy relationship to education, and as such, most of what I will discuss today will be autobiographical. For that, I do apologize. So, that caveat given, the autobiographical anecdote begins. Throughout my many years in education, many in relation to the number of years I have existed, I have had both very good and very bad experiences. What has surprised me is that it is not immediately obvious which are the good experiences and which are the bad experiences. As a young student in my teens, I was a very bookish person, to the point of preferring the company of words and ideas to that of people. Many were the night that my family would try to encourage me to leave my room and my books and be a little bit more social. I was an A student, and it so fell that at the age of 13, I was invited to skip a year so that I might be more challenged by the curriculum. To all extents and purposes, it would appear that these were good experiences. My teachers at the time certainly thought so, as did my parents, despite their slight annoyance at having a socially slightly inept daughter. But with hindsight, I would like to propose that these were not, in fact, the good experiences, that they certainly were not bad, but that in itself does not qualify them to be labeled as good. The first time I became aware of having a good educational experience came shortly after I started studying here. It was not something which happened at the AA, but rather the memory of a much earlier experience, which suddenly dawned on me as having been a genuinely good educational experience. As I mentioned, I was bookish when I was younger. I was very interested in my education, and by consequence, there were classes I loved and classes I was not so keen with. For example, I took a disproportionately intense dislike to my English teacher on the grounds that she used the word stuff too often. By comparison, I was completely smitten with my math teacher on the grounds that when I proposed to write an essay on the number 0, rather than complete a long set of equations, I was not only allowed to do so, but got a flashing A on the assignment. It so followed that 3 years later, age 17, when it came time for me to decide what I should study in university, I sought out the advice of said math teacher and asked, rather naively, "Do you think I could study architecture?" And he said no. His reasoning being that I was not good enough at math and would never be able to do any of the structural calculations. Now, it was the memory of this experience which struck me as having been my first really good educational experience. If you, by comparison, were listening to this anecdote and thought, this must be what she means by educational failure, you are in fact wrong. It is easy enough to imagine why you might think so. Headline reads, "Math teacher derails young girl's dream of becoming an architect by highlighting a real, albeit inconsequential, shortcoming in her mathematical abilities." My math teacher, my much adored math teacher, who let me write about the number 0 when most would have refused, had given me bad advice, really bad advice. In fact, it wasn't so much advice as it was a straight-up command. No, after all, is not advice. It took me 10 years to figure out that the person I should be asking if I could study architecture was in fact myself, not my math teacher. And when I did finally ask myself, the answer was a resounding yes. But it took 10 years to get to that conclusion. Frankly, getting to that own conclusion, to my own conclusion, turned out to be the best educational experience I've had so far. Now that I'm on the other side of things, now that I am one of the educators, I often refer back to that moment, the moment of my teacher's epic fail, and what it ended up doing for me in the long run. As educators, we have an innate desire to educate and to pass on bodies of knowledge. We have, I would argue, an innate desire to not fail, to not let down our students, and to provide guidance and skills and knowledge which will help our students avoid any pitfalls and all things bad. But in so doing, what we accidentally do is remove education from the realm of personal growth and discovery. We divorce education from life, and in turn transform it into an island unto itself, where only the academic can live, and perhaps even more destructively, an island in which only academics can communicate. We are educators within a given discipline, and there's no doubt that it is that discipline with which we want to acquaint our students. We are not self-help therapists, so why, you might ask, would we concern ourselves with either personal growth or personal discovery? Why must we subscribe to the cult of self? The answer, I would argue, is precisely in order to ensure the validity and existence of our discipline. If we look at what architecture is today versus what it was 50 years ago or even 30 years ago, we find ourselves with a vastly changed field. These changes have come as much from internal as they have come from external forces. So if our discipline is a constantly changing one, where the boundaries are fuzzy, if what we teach, if the realm in which we work is fuzzy, how can we, as proponents of that discipline, as the educators of that field, be anything but fuzzy? If we are averse to failing, and if we are averse to seeing our students fail, we are denying the fuzzy. So let us assume for a moment that you are all on board, that you agree and we should all embrace failure, both our own and that of our students. What exactly does that mean? And how do we qualify our own profession as educators if we end by having waves of students failing year in and year out? In truth, I think it is much easier said than done. It is incredibly difficult to watch somebody fail and not intervene, even when we know that it may be a lesson they simply have to learn. We still have a desire to reach out and solve the problem. Who among us wants to be the teacher who made the comment that led to the 10-year derailment? I imagine not very many amongst us. Quite aside from that, even if someone was remarkably brave and was in fact willing to allow a student to go through that painful but necessary failure, the fact is most students are themselves pretty reluctant to fail. And it is not everyone that can lift the veil of failure and show that it is actually okay. This, I would argue, comes down to a very basic relationship, that between tutor and student. And that at the base, a very simple understanding on the part of the tutor that a student is not a tabula rasa. We are all familiar with the phrase, there are as many histories as there are historians. I propose that there are as many architectures as there are architecture students. On a very practical level, in order to embrace the full potential of the fail, we need to engage the individuality of each and every student, and that is not an easy thing. As educators, we are confronted with a new set of possible futures every year. Each student comes with his or her own past, and by consequence, his or her own trajectory of the future. It is an exercise in the absurd to imagine that we, as educators, are left unscathed in this dialogue, or in fact, that we can somehow ignore this dialogue. My proposal is that this is precisely where we ought to engage, in this multitude of active pasts and possible futures, which opens the possibility to fail. Now, before I finish, I would just like to quickly make a link to women, because so far everything I've said has been predominantly gender neutral, mainly because sometimes I think there is a benefit to speaking in general before delving into the specific, but also because I often feel that it is dangerous to assume that being a woman, I am somehow allowed to make statements on the behalf of women as a whole. So I will introduce my last and final caveat, which is that this is a speculation, and I put it forward to be considered only. As women, we have gone through remarkable changes in the past few generations. For me, these could best be illustrated with reference to the knight in shining armor. For those of you that are unfamiliar with the concept, the knight in shining armor is the prince, often good-looking and wealthy, who saves the princess, also often good-looking and wealthy, in the last scene of most fairy tales. Now, there was a generation of women that was entirely comfortable with this relationship to the knight. There was a subsequent generation who questioned why it was the woman who always had to be saved. And so the story was flipped. And what we were given were a series of fairy tales in which the princess saved the prince. I believe that there is a third alternative to this relationship between the knight and the princess, and that is that no one saves anyone. That if we have the presence of mind to stand back and take in the situation, it may turn out that actually no one needs saving. All we need to do is embrace a little more failure in our lives. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I imagine many people have questions to ask after both of your rather intriguing presentations and quite different in many ways, in good ways. So I'm going to start with a few questions of my own. Firstly, I was quite intrigued by the fact that Auckland sounds like an incredibly gender-balanced institution. Why this strikes me as important is that in the UK, we actually have 1/3 of our academic staff are female in schools of architecture, but only 1 in 40 are in leadership positions, i.e. Head of school. Compare this to the US, where 1 in 4 are deans in schools of architecture, and you see a massive drop in transmission between two in otherwise quite comparable regions. So what might explain this? Do you think it's a policy thing or a pedagogy thing?
It's definitely not a policy thing, because our faculty is unusual. The University of Auckland has 8 faculties, and ours is the only faculty that has a woman as dean. And then, so having had 3 in a row makes it more unusual. Similarly, across the university, I don't know the exact figure, but it's definitely a minority of heads of school or heads of department that are women. So there is something cumulative, I guess, happening within our school. And I guess part of it is, if you have the women as dean, then they're going to open up opportunities for women coming up potentially as heads of school or heads of department. But I don't think it's all of that. I think in our school there's a kind of culture of some of the women just having a stronger sense of duty or service towards the institution than some of the male staff are. So some of it is about men ducking for cover.
Right.
Yeah.
Why might they be ducking for cover, do you think?
Just because the jobs have a reputation for being a lot of work, quite stressful, not always easy.
So in a way, what you're describing is what's commonly known as the glass cliff face, where women are often brought in as fixers, people who are there to, in some ways, address the problems previously created by men, a bit like in banking in Iceland, for example. So do you think that's actually what's happening in higher education now in schools of architecture, that we have so many pressures, from usually driven by government and cuts into funding and so on, that in a way make higher education, particularly schools of architecture, very attractive to women as places to go and be mistreated and underpaid, casualised, provided with low childcare facilities and obviously poor promotion prospects? Do you think that's why so many of us find that attractive now, and that's what's happening?
Well, there's many different points that you've raised within that comment.
But yeah, I think it's an area for research, isn't it?
Yeah.
But possibly not why that's happening at Auckland.
Yeah.
You just think that it's actually to do with more positive aspects of leading a school of architecture.
Yeah, I mean, so many issues there. I think for me in the school at the moment, I don't think of it as a place with glass ceilings. I think whatever opportunities you want, they're there to be taken, to be had.
Yeah.
There is definitely difference between women who've chosen to have children and women who haven't had children. The majority of the women in those roles are women who've chosen not to have children. So there's nothing kind of perfect situation about it. There are still many of the issues that are relevant within other institutions apparent in ours as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to bring you into the conversation, actually, not just feel it's you and I, as lovely as it is. But I was intrigued by the comments you made, and quite a few comments around this notion of autobiography, autoethnography, and the cult of self, and that made me think about the kind of trend in selfieism that we're now facing, where, the next generation, in many ways our students, are conspicuous in the way that they position themselves, constantly recording what they do, and how that's starting to inform their self-awareness about much of, if you like, the intersectionality challenges they're facing, if they're coming from different backgrounds and, issues beyond being just women, but beyond that. I'd really like it if you talk a bit more about this idea about the cult of self and what you think that means, how that might have a pedagogic influence within schools of architecture in future.
Yeah, I mean, again, I want to stress that I'm a person who speaks about this on the basis that I've been teaching for 5 years, and I have no kind of professional training on this subject, but my feeling and my worry often with students today is that the cult of self, the way it's kind of engaged with, particularly at this point in a person's career or their evolution as people, is that it is a very constructed concept. And in a sense, when it becomes really interesting is when it's not so much something that's constructed by outside forces, whether it's, you want to have the coolest Instagram feed, or I'm sure there's like a more modern version of Instagram that I don't know about. But it's a very, very different thing when you ask a student to deal with the idea of a self as a much more complex and fragile thing that does have cracks and kind of emerges in its own way. At times, I mentioned pastry. If you watch like bread rise in the oven, it will kind of bubble up on one side and look really unappealing until it kind of finally reaches its full form. And I think many students are uncomfortable about going through that period where it is a bit awkward and funny looking and it's just not right. And we kind of all know that, but you have to do it anyway. So I think it's two very different things. Yes, I do think this generation is very self-aware in a certain way, but it is a constructed self that I think sometimes can actually get in the way of things.
So is the solution then, or a possible tactic, to reimagine how we might set briefs, for example, to get students to address certain aspects of imperfect briefs or imperfect buildings and spaces?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think a lot of it can be done in the briefs, but also a lot of it can be done in the way that we teach. One thing, obviously I've studied and teach here, so I have a bias towards this school, but I think one thing that has always helped is having the time and the space available for the one-to-one, whether it's the one-to-one tutorial or the seminar with smaller groups of students, the setting up an environment where it's not that I have this discipline that I'm now passing on to you, right? But it's really like it's part of a conversation, and it's as much what you give as what I give. So it's a two-way kind of relationship. I think that does a lot to kind of break these preconception things that we carry around, which is normal, right? Nobody wants to walk around like a broken vase, I think.
Maybe, yes.
Or I don't know.
Yeah. No, that's interesting. So this idea that you were touching on, obviously, in what you described, Sarah Treadwell specifically, and her legacies within the institution, this idea of the emphasis on drawing culture and research culture and so on. What do you think the responsibilities are of women academics in architecture schools in relation to encouraging other young female students, and indeed all students, to recognise the contribution of female architects and female academics?
It's hard. No, that's a difficult question.
Yeah, that was my plan.
Okay.
I think it's always going to be something that's of interest to some academics more than others. So the responsibility falls to those who are interested in it. I think there is a particular responsibility placed on those of us who teach history and theory of architecture, because it's up to us to be able to bring the women from the past into our history programs, and it's just not always easy when you've got a lot of material to cover in courses that have set descriptions or prescriptions. So the postgraduate seminars are an excellent opportunity to start growing greater interest, but also schools that offer studio programs where students can choose their design topic for particular semesters just also have more opportunity, I think, because you can have diversity embedded into those studio topics across a year group rather than having the whole class working on the same topic, which really kind of limits things.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I was certainly, when I was in the US recently, a discussion on this issue. It was presented that actually the historians are over-obligated to discuss, the histories of women architects and women academics, and in fact what should be happening more is a shift towards seeing the stories of women as being impacting on the briefs, for example, and the agenda set within studios. Have either of you encountered any attempts? I know we're going to hear from someone tomorrow who's done a great job of doing this, but have either of you encountered any briefs that you feel have actually addressed issues that, if you like, more closely pertain to the interests and agendas and experiences of women?
I'm sure that there have been lots of them, but I can't think of any of them at the moment. I know ones that I've taught myself, I've I've kind of consciously pursued cultural issues rather than
Right.
gender issues and studio topics. Yeah, even though it's an area of interest, but I haven't pursued it myself in studio.
I think, I mean, I'm not sure if this is kind of an answer to the question, but at the moment I'm teaching a brief which is about the relationship between nature and the city. And when I first proposed this last year, I said it in passing to a few students who incidentally happened to be male. And they went, "Oh, that's a really girly topic." And I was like, okay. Like, I really didn't see why it was. And incidentally, it's now the first year teaching it. And 80% of the people that signed up for my studio are girls, which I'm totally happy with. I mean, it's a great environment. But I really didn't, it's really funny because I hadn't even seen it as a kind of gender, I didn't feel I was taking a position. But obviously from the point of view of a young 20-year-old studying architecture, it's a girly topic.
Well, that's fascinating. It's worth investigating that further, I imagine. In terms of their work so far, what have they actually been producing?
Well, I mean, the girls in particular, or
Or all the students?
all the
in
students?
response to
Okay,
this
no,
brief?
because we do have kind of 4 boys that everybody's really curious to see what they're going to do in this like strongly, girly unit. Well, it's very. I mean, it's very much. It borrows a lot from kind of surrealist ideas. So there's a lot of kind of absurd things being constructed at the moment. All kind of to deal with the typologies and relationships that we have to nature at the moment. And I think, introducing really interesting questions, but maybe a bit dull, I think, for this audience. I don't know. Do you want to hear about plants? I think. Maybe.
Well, no, it's just I wasn't sure if you were going to tell me that they were all designing retirement homes for old women with allotments.
No.
That kind of thing.
Yeah, no, not at all, not at all.
So it's reassuring in many ways that actually they're seeing it. Their interpretation of if you like, what sounds very much like a feminine to some people, design studio is not necessarily resulting in gendered outcomes. So that's interesting. I think I'll indulge myself with one last question. It was what you mentioned about this notion of women's ability to think beyond the two-dimensional realm. You're probably aware that Walter Gropius actually thought about this in Bauhaus and insisted that women couldn't study architecture because they couldn't think in 3 dimensions, and sent them all off into the weaving rooms, where all of these frustrated women created these incredible textured, very 3-dimensional patterns and shapes within their looms as a means to try and express their, if you like, 3-dimensional spatial inclinations and their architectural frustrations. So I'm intrigued. I just wonder what your view is on this particular challenge, because I don't think there's necessarily been a conclusive study that's ever bothered to debunk this nonsense, and I sometimes think it's important to go after the myths as much as the things that are, closer to sounding more truthful. But what's your view on how, female students often perceive their ability to design in ways that are entirely commensurate with male students?
I mean, I found that oddly, it's not a matter of skill, but there is definitely, I have noticed a difference in attitude and in confidence. I often get the feeling that with male students, I have nothing against male students, but they feel really entitled to build that building. And it's like the most inevitable thing in the world that you're going to construct something. And it's not a real kind of issue that they really grapple with. Whereas I find with many of my female students, there's a question of should something more be brought into the city or into the world. There's a consciousness about the idea of creating something new, which it's a bit more apprehensive. For me, it's much more interesting in terms of what it produces as work. But I don't know how have you found that.
And I know you're a historian and they're writing papers for you rather than designing things, but have you noticed any?
I have taught studio, just not in recent years. But I guess for me, I haven't kind of gone back through my studio.
So nothing really conspicuous. They all seem similar in the way they approach them.
Different is more. The word different is what my thinking rather than similar, and just I guess encouraging difference.
Yeah.
Yeah, letting people feel confident in their difference rather than having to, rather than wanting to draw similarities.
Yeah,
based
and those
on
differences
gender
are
lines.
obviously beyond gender boundaries and reach out in all other ways, I imagine.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very multicultural environment, so there's multiple differences going on.
Okay. I'm going to open this up now and have some questions from someone who hasn't got flu. There's a microphone and a... Great.
Okay, super. Thank you. I wasn't sure. Hi, I'm going to ask Sylvia just to go what you were just talking about before with the male students having this entitlement to build something, and how you were talking about female students somewhat thinking about whether something should be built or not. I think this is a fascinating topic, and I've worked 23 years in 5 different countries, and for me, this idea of, I don't call it confidence, I call it overconfidence and hubris, which I encounter that a lot of male students or men in the industry have. And so I don't know where this comes from, if it's in primary school or when kids are born and they're just gendered right from the beginning, but I think it's a fascinating topic. So I'm not really asking you a question, I'm just saying that that's actually a very fascinating thing that you're observing. Thank you.
I mean, if I can, I agree. I'm always a bit curious if that should be called confidence or overconfidence, but and sometimes I do agree with you. I have to say, like, I see it happening and I think like, But then on the other hand, it's really funny to follow it through to its logical conclusion, because there's because there's often in that way of thinking so little consideration that the thinking through process comes much later, where it's actually much more destructive to kind of consider things later. I feel, obviously, like I'm biased, but so I do feel that by the time you get to the end of the year, things have kind of balanced out, but the trajectories to begin with are really very different, I would say. I mean, the feeling.
Hi, I teach first year architecture, which is really fun, so I get them right at the beginning. And something I've tried to engender in my year this year is that they have loads of skill already, they know about the world already, and I'm interested to learn what they know. I'm trying to design new briefs for next year as well, and I just wanted to know if the panel had any good briefs or things where you were celebrating the skills that they already had, and to sort of get them thinking that, yeah, I guess their experiences are worthwhile to bring to School of Architecture and to that discipline. So yeah, have you got any good first year briefs? So I can steal them.
There's lots of good first year stuff on those conferences and organised by the Architectural Educators UK, and I'm sure that they're coming through in their publication Charrette as well, and the website that run out of a university near Chicago or Detroit called something like early designers or beginning design, teaching beginning design or something like that. Yeah, lots of good inspiration.
Yeah, and there's one,
to be
the
found.
National Conference for the Beginning Design Student in the US. The next one's in
that's the same thing I was thinking
Minneapolis,
of.
isn't it, in March? I think you can still go. But they're all about first year teaching, but specifically with gendered things, or certainly briefs that are more sensitive to gender, not specifically about designing for women. I tend to find with students, set them a very early brief that gets them to consider designing for themselves as clients, and understand something. Really, that's one way for them to reveal, if you like, what their own interests could be. I also like to encourage them to see feminism as a design tool. So, feminism is something that is about deconstructing preconceived ideas. It's about creating a means through which one can systematically attack a set of assumptions about behaviours that are prescriptive and controlling and limiting. It's a means through which biases and inequalities can be discerned and then tackled. And it's also useful as a way for generating alternatives, just as a theory. But we tend to teach feminism just within history and theory courses and not within design studio. So I think there's a lot of appropriation that could happen just between the modularisation of architecture education that's in many ways limiting the efficacy of some of the content in relation to design studio. So that would be a start, I imagine. But also, the Good Old Life project, get students out there designing for clients in need. And, if you're based in the US right now, Planned Parenthood needs you immediately. And certainly here, things aren't looking so great either, with Brexit looming, so there's a number of communities of all kinds of, if you like, demographic configurations that definitely need some kind of real-time response. So I think that would be a really good tactic for a first year.
I think if I could add to that, I don't want to discount any of these responses because I think they're fantastic responses. But in a funny way, I think you're doing yourself an injustice by asking that question. Because at least I find that one of the greatest joys of writing a brief is that you make this thing and then you put it out there in the world and you get this weird feedback that you never saw coming, and it's kind of it's a bummer if you don't do that. And I think I genuinely think you can create a brief out of anything, really. And in a sense, like one of the joys of being able to write one is that you get to put your own interests into it and see where you get the bounce back. I think obviously as well as.
And coming back to a point that you both raised, I thought was very interesting. The way that, in a way, what we do to allow the barriers we create before we allow students even into the profession. So we're saying maths and physics, engineering and all these other skills. And we never really say, actually, one of the qualities, not just qualifications, that a young person might need is around empathy or some sort of compassion or affinity for others. And these are qualities that are just completely overlooked in our assessments and even our own gatekeeping on educational experience of architecture. So I think I'd be careful in allowing students to actually set their own, it's what Knowles in the 1970s used to call learning contracts, where he'd get the students to, if you like, co-author their own design briefs and also their own assessment criteria. And it was a means of actually recognising what students were bringing in terms of the things that they thought they should be recognised for, the skills that they had, and skills and qualities that we would otherwise overlook or not see as being important within our own demographic metrics. So I think the next generation has a lot to teach us about the values they think are important in terms of their own academic performance and ultimately how that could influence architecture education.
I had a question. So about Sylvie's conversation about failure, which I think is super interesting, partly because it makes me think of the ignorant schoolmaster piece and the sort of values. And one thing it made me also think of is that if you're in my sort of position, then there's metrics that come in at the bureaucracy of education, which are increasingly powerful, like retention figures, and they're now counted as part of teaching excellence frameworks. And one of the things that I think is a real irony, a sort of bind, is that I think a lot of people, a lot of educators would subliminally and intuitively totally agree with you that in failure at some various levels exists, the learning experience. But in those sorts of retention figures, you're really held up to, any sort of lack of progress onto the next level being a problem. And in particular for BME and gender, that's really brought forward that if those people are not being retained and progressing, meaning if failure is basically a serious problem for any of those sort of demographics. And I think that's an interesting thing. I don't know what one could do about it, because in a way it's like the problem of education now, which is it sort of exists at this other macro level. But it does make me also think that what is the other driver about failure is the competition that exists between educational institutions. And this, I guess the fact that we're drawn into giving our students success or forcing success upon them because we're also the problem of failure as an institution is an issue. So I don't know if there's any thoughts you've got. It's a sort of, I think it's a really big conundrum because education now exists completely differently, and I think failure was part of an intellectual journey.
Yeah.
40, 50 years ago.
I mean, I completely agree, and you know, I've had several conversations, particularly on that topic, when you kind of find yourself. Obviously, the AA at the moment is going through a series of changes as well, and there is a genuine fear that at one point the thing that's kind of drives everything is bureaucracy, actually, and it isn't. It's no longer a matter of the tutors brought in or the director brought in, because the number of box ticking exercises. And frankly, I don't know. I mean, the only thing I can imagine is that on some level we have to work on two different planes.
Yeah, I mean, I guess we have to make a sort of success out of failure in our learning outcomes. Well, we have to do something. I guess it's the loss. It's the sort of inability to risk anymore, I think, in the system, and that in a way, I guess it's relevant to the talking about women and in education, students and staff, because in a way it's most pointed towards those. You know, we're both supposed to provide representation at a greater level, success at a greater level. Mm-hmm. But if we genuinely think that comes through failure or cycles of failure, it's a complete conflict.
Mm-hmm. I mean, maybe one thing that's also worth highlighting is, I think that if not that I know how to do this, right? But in an ideal world, if you are able as a tutor to create an environment where failure is tolerated, it may often kind of be experienced, but not fully. It kind of then doesn't lead to the full collapse that a denial of failure creates, right? So ironically, I don't think that embracing the possibility of that would necessarily lead to loads and loads of students failing. I think it would just lead probably to periods of either no production or very low production, in which case it really falls on the tutor to be comfortable with that they may at one point have a studio where 30 or 40% of their students are just not producing because they're in that moment. So I don't suddenly think that we should all fail our students. It's not.
Okay. So this is the last question, apparently, right? Okay.
Okay, so I will try
So
to
it
be
has to
quick.
be special.
No pressure.
No pressure.
Okay. Just going back to the worrying figure of women in higher position in academia. Mm-hmm. So I guess we could agree that architecture and it used to be a gentleman club more. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I guess the academia is something really similar. So it's a very dangerous combo of the two things. So I was just wondering if any of your institutions where you're working, if you have active or just informal strategies to create a women's club, just to fight this gentleman's club. For example, in social, I work in social science, for example, and there's this group called the Resistors, or the lecturers, especially first at the beginning of their career. So I'm just wondering if in your institution you have some formal or informal forms of resistance.
No, not in mine. How about you? No. No.
Does this count?
Yeah, but there are some organisations that are not, that if you like, transcend institutions. Parlour in Australia. I think they're here actually tomorrow, maybe. They're really doing really interesting work. Architects, Xaxis, which is an American-based group, are doing a lot to raise the profile of women architects, and there's a few things around that are certainly trying to not only, if you like, better represent the interests of women architects, but also women academics too. But I think there's nothing in a way cohesive necessarily that's tackling the problem. Certainly within institutions, I don't know of any one institution that necessarily, in a way, is shining a beacon of optimism. I know that Mel, who spoke before about the failure conundrum, your dean, Jeremy Till would like to consider his efforts at Sheffield as his attempt to create a feminist school of architecture many years ago, where he quite deliberately recruited many women to the programme at a time when they were in very short supply, or at least low representation across architectural academia. So I think there's been small efforts, pockets of resistance, if you like, but regrettably we don't have a strategy. But it's a great thing to end on, actually, because clearly it would be useful if we start thinking about developing them internally and perhaps amongst ourselves after this event. And so the next time we're all here in our little jars 100 years from now with electrodes beeping, we can swap notes on what we've achieved in the last 100 years. But thanks, that's a very great question to end upon. Thank you very much, and thanks to the speakers.
Thank you.